Okay, now we're going to take one of the wiring and screw kits apart and go through the parts and let you know what's in here. Alright, this is the wiring that you're going to need, plus the other wiring that Robert put in there, which is over here off to the side. So this is going to be the wiring for the kit. Pretty much everything you're going to need. These are 3mm by 10mm screws. These are the ones that hold the drivers in and the ones that go into the top and bottom of the end caps, not the sides. You've got the crossover plate, which has all the holes in it. You've also got a foam backer that goes onto the extrusion so that nothing on the back of the crossover can possibly touch the chassis. Rubber feet for the bottom of the speaker when it's done. Heat shrink for anything you want to heat shrink. You've got the coil for the crossover, which we're going to use. You have resistors, capacitors. Let me get them all out, then I'll go through them and tell you what everything is. Okay, got your binding posts. We'll use those later. XLR connector for the bottom of the speaker. I'll do that later. These are your 4mm by 8 or 10mm screws. I'm not sure how long they were. I think about 8 or 10. These are the ones that hold the ribbons in. These are 3mm by 12mm. These are the screws that go into these 4 holes. Your top and bottom holes for each driver, side firing driver. These need to be longer because they go through the driver, the chassis, and into the bracket on the back side that hold the end caps on. So make sure you don't get these mixed up with the bag that has a lot more screws. These are the 10s, these are the 12s, and these are only for these 8 holes on your chassis. Okay, so don't get those mixed up later. Otherwise you'll try using the shorter screws where you need a longer screw and it's not going to work very well. So we'll put those aside. Okay, and then these 4 screws are 3mm by 4mm long. These you're going to need for the crossover. These hold the crossover into the extrusion. Again, if you look inside the extrusion, you can see down in here there are very small standoffs that are pressed into the back of the chassis. You can kind of see where they're located. They kind of disappear once they powder coat over them. But on the inside, that's where the standoffs are to mount the crossover to. Okay? So we'll leave these out because we're going to need these in the end. Alright, on the website and in the manual, you're going to have a schematic and a layout for your crossover. And it's very simple, really. The textured side is the face, the smooth side is the back. Okay, so start with the textured side up. And in here you have the easiest way to tell what side is up is you've got 2 holes that are directly across from each other, dead center of the plate. Those 2 holes are the ones that the coil goes through. So it's very easy to start with the coil, find its location, and then you can work from there. Just make sure your tabs are bent straight. And I find it, you're going to probably want to take the tape off of the coil because the capacitor, I'm sorry, the resistor that is parallel to the coil needs to go underneath this tape. So I found it's easier, just take the tape off for now. If you want to put it back on later, feel free. If not, throw it away. Doesn't really matter. So you've got your coil that fits in those 2 holes almost perfectly, and that gives you a good heads up to your top and bottom of your crossover. The coil is the bottom of the crossover. Okay, so you can start there. Now in here you've got, on your parts list, it'll give you all the descriptions, but you've got 220 ohm 5-watt resistors. There should be 4 of those. I'm just going to straighten all the leads because I like kind of being a little anal when it comes to putting stuff together so it looks nice. So those are all 220s. This will be the last 220. And then this one should be 16 ohms, and it is. This is the one that goes with the coil. And the pictures on the website show us taking this resistor and straddling the coil itself. So you basically put it right on top. And you can put a piece of tape or silicone or anything you want between here. But even if for some reason the coil insulation should come off, it's really not going to make any difference because you're going right to a resistor which is isolated itself, so it really wouldn't matter if it did short out. But your first step is going to be taking the resistor, bending your leads down to the coil, and soldering those two connections. Okay? Once you've got those connected, then you can drop it back into the plate and start soldering everything else. So that'll be your first step. These I'm going to just go through and I'll show people who really don't have much idea on how to solder and work on components, how to do some of this. It's very simple once you practice a little bit. But the leads, I like to try to get them as straight as possible. And if you run into a problem where you can't get the lead straight enough because it's got a really bad kink in it, just take a pair of pliers that has a nice flat spot, and just take your capacitor, your wire, crimp it and turn it, and it helps straighten the wires out pretty nicely. Most of them are, the wire's so thin you can just kind of pull it and stretch it and get it pretty straight. Like this one right here, real close to the capacitor, is kind of right up against the resistor. It's pretty kinked, and I can't get my fingers in there, so I just take the pliers, pinch it and turn it, and it straightens it pretty nicely for you. There you go. So now you've got all your leads pretty straight. Alright, I'm going to start by soldering the 16 ohm resistor to the coil. And to do this, it's nice to have 3 or 4 hands when you're doing things like this, but obviously we don't, so sometimes I get little alligator tools to hold stuff. For this one, I'll probably just tin the 2 of them and then solder them together. It'll be a little bit easier than trying to manage 2 parts while they're flopping around. So I'll just take some solder. Put a decent little bead right there on the lead. Nothing crazy. You don't need a ton of solder. You just need something to attach to. Okay. Gives you a little bit of solder there. And we'll do the same thing on the end of the resistor. We've got 2 nice tinned pieces to start with. It's much easier when it goes to connecting the parts together. See right there, that's basically soldered on there. And when you go to connect these 2, it becomes much easier when you sit there and just touch it to it, and the solder jumps across nicely. And you can see they're pretty close. I'm going to take and bend this down just a little bit extra so that the wire is just touching. And then all you got to do is melt the solder, make sure the one on the other lead melts with it, and you've got a really good connection. I mean, that's not coming off by any means. And you come over here, do the same thing. Just bend the wire down just a little bit to make sure that it touches the lead on the coil. And I'm just going to grab a little bit extra glob of solder. Make sure it makes a good contact. And then you solder those two leads together. And that's it. There you go. So now you got your resistor and your coil parallel together. Okay. Now you can take the two of these, put them into the board. Now this lead sticks down a little bit more than the other one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that hole just a little bit so that that little piece of, it doesn't really matter which one. I can do it on the bottom one or the top one. But I'm going to open up that hole just a hair so that it accepts the wire and the solder that's built up there. And it's easy. You can take a pair of pliers and do it, but I'm going to do it the easy way. Take the soldering iron. Just open the hole up a hair. Now you can fit everything through there, and it bottoms out pretty nicely. Now I would suggest when you guys are building your crossovers to break out your silicone in the little black, and I would definitely recommend putting just a little glob of silicone on the bottom of each component. And it's not so much to keep the parts on the board, but it's to keep anything from possibly rattling down the road. If for some reason your parts aren't flush and you're pushing your speakers pretty hard, this thing could vibrate and chatter and cause some noise. It's possible. It's not likely, but it's possible. So I would recommend just putting a small glob of silicone between each component and the backer plate when you go to assemble it, just for safety reasons. But I'm not going to do that on this one right now. As far as just doing how to assemble everything, I'm not going to bother doing that because that's going to take quite a while to dry, and I don't want to make a mess while I'm doing it. So we're just going to do it without it for right now. And so that's it. That's the hardest part of your crossover. If you get that part worked out, the rest of it's very simple. Next you go to your 220 resistors, and basically what I like to do is take a small pair of needle nose pliers, go right up against the resistor or capacitor, whatever component you're doing, and then bend it down. Okay? And I like doing that because it leaves a little bit of a gap between the wire and the component itself. It looks nice. It gives you a little bit of extra room when you're putting the parts together. If you do need to solder to this lead, it gives you a little bit of extra room to work with. And we pretty much laid out the board so that if you did leave that extra room, your leads fit through perfectly. Okay, so they should, if you do that. If not, you're going to come out at an angle down into the holes. Either way, it won't matter too much. But I'll go ahead and do all four of these real quick. Okay, we're going to do the same thing with all the capacitors. Just take the little ends off, straighten the leads out so they're nice. Okay, And then I'm going to do the same thing. Just put the pliers right there next to it, bend it over. And we did the same thing for the capacitors as the resistors on the board. Is left that little bit of extra room so that when you, if you bend them this way, they should drop right in. Okay, that's it for the components. Now I basically just plug all the parts into the board. And, make it so that all the text faces the same direction, so it's pretty. Got those two resistors go there. The other two go on this side. And you've got your large capacitor, which is going to go up here between these two holes that are spaced apart. Like I said, everything just drops right in. Very, very simple. Same thing with this capacitor. And then you've got the last small one, which goes in between these two. And again, it just drops in. I mean, I don't know how we could have made it much simpler. Alright, once you've got your components all laid out on the board, and yours should look just like this. If you look on the website already, you've seen the photographs of how it's laid out. And there's a real close-up of it. Again, you've got that one resistor parallel kind of saddled on top of the coil. And that's pretty much it. Now I'm going to hold all these components in and then flip it over so you can see what you're dealing with on the back side. Okay, this looks like a mess. Okay, there's lots of wires hanging out here. I'm not sure how easy or how well it's going to show up on the camera when it comes time, but you know, you've got all those leads sticking out the back. And really, it's not going to be that difficult. Okay, what I recommend you do is, once you know everything fits, it's going to be easier to do one or two components at a time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the coil and let the rest of them fall back out for now. I'm just going to take them all back out. Okay, let's start with the coil. What I would recommend you do is on the coil is bend this center lead. This is going to be your primary input to the crossover. Okay, though it's right in the center of the board. We tried to make it so that all the components went around and it was easy to figure out where what wiring went where later when it came to hooking up the drivers and all of the other leads. So this leg of the coil, which is the center of the board, that's your positive input from either the binding post or the XLR, or wherever your speaker wires are coming in from. That's your input. Okay, this one I would recommend you probably take this lead and bend it down. Okay, once you bend it down, and I wouldn't crimp it all the way to the board just yet because you can get some of these other leads under it later. Once you do that, this thing's not going to fall out by any means. Now this lead, this is going to be the output to the side firing drivers, or your woofers. We'll call them woofers from now on, even though they're mid-range drivers. But what I would recommend you do is take this lead and bend it over. You can bend it in, but then they start getting a little close. So probably better off taking this lead and bending it over like 90 degrees to one side or the other. Okay. So you've got your input from your speakers, and this is going to be the output to your woofers. Very simple. Okay. So that these two components right here are the only components that are connected to the side firing drivers. Everything else in the network is going to be for the ribbon itself. Okay. So you've got that. Very, very simple. Now let's take a couple of the 220 resistors, plug those back in. Now each side of this network, the left and the right side, once you've got it, because you've got two resistors here, and you've got two resistors over on the other side. Both of these are basically loops that will go around and meet again at the top. Okay, so these two sets of components need to touch that center leg. Okay, and the easiest way we found is just bend this one over to that one, bend that one in towards the center, and you'll be able to solder those together. And you'll do the same thing on the other side. Now these two will just get bent towards each other because they are paralleled. So that doesn't matter too much. Now we'll do the other two. And again, these two resistors are parallel with each other. So the same thing. That central leg has to go in and touch the input from the coil. Okay. So if you bend this one down and that one over, you can connect all three of those leads there, and then these two are parallel so they can just bend over towards each other. Once you go to put the coils in, they will connect out here to these leads. Okay, so right now all your components are on the board. They're stuck in there, they really can't go anywhere. Okay, then we'll do the larger capacitor next. So when you flip it over, you've got this one, and this one is here, and that one goes there. Okay, so we're going to take this one, this capacitor, this one's going to come down and touch those two resistors right there. Okay. Then this capacitor, you're going to do the same thing. It's going to come down and touch these two resistors. Okay. And then you've got these, which come down. This small resistor comes down towards the center. The other end of that small capacitor goes up to these two. These three leads of all three capacitors need to touch. Okay, they're going to be the output to the ribbon. Okay, so you can bend these any way you really like, as long as you've got a central way of them touching. So you bend that one over, bend that one up, and bend that one up. That's going to be your connection. Okay, so basically from the back side, again, this central coil is your input, and this is the output to your woofer. This becomes the output to your ribbon, and these are all just parallel connections back here. Okay, so get a close-up of that. Again, this is on the forum, so you can see a picture of it when it's all done. This is the input right here in the center. That's the output to your woofers, and then these three capacitors where all three of these touch right here, that's the output to the ribbon. Okay, and I'm going to stop the video for a second, kind of get all this tidied up real nicely, and then I'll solder it all and put the wires on and everything next.